We are now recording. Very good. So I'm going to continue to work to admit people as they come in. Hi, Bill. Oh, yes. Hi, Bill. Bill is from the Texas Master Naturalist, and he is going to be taking the Master Naturalist training here in Nebraska. So I'm excited to have you on. And again, for some of you that just joined us, we're coming out of the Niobrara Valley Preserve complete training, and we have some of the master naturalists on here. It was a really great week. We will never be the same. For sure. It was such an incredibly lovely experience, and I am honored to have been a part of it for sure. Okay, so we're at 12:30. For those of you who do not know me, I am Jamie Bachman, and I am the program coordinator for the Nebraska Master Naturalist. If you've never been to Master Naturalist Mondays, we will have I'm still trying to, what's the word? Not micromanage, but try to do double duty on all the things that I'm trying to do. Okay, letting people in. Okay, so if you've never been to Master Naturalist Mondays, the flow of the hour is this. We will head into a reflective prompt that is it will be in theme with what we are covering today with our presenter Jason Thiele, who is going to be presenting on burrowing owls. So that's pretty exciting. That's the critter that's on our logo. We'll do a reflective prompt, and then I'll introduce our speaker officially, and he will present, and then we'll have time for questions. And then at the end, I will go over some of our events that we have coming up and a call to action. So I'm just going to go ahead and begin. During the reflective prompt, please feel free. This one is we're keeping it light today. I'm feeling so good after the training. So I wanted to keep it light and funny. Can everybody see the reflective prompt? Okay. So there are some what I like to call the poster children for wildlife conservation or connection to nature, and some examples of these types of species are ladybugs. Ladybugs are a soft, gentle connection. They're bright red. They're our friends, and a lot of children especially can connect to nature through their relationships with ladybugs. Another one is the fuzzy wuzzies. The fuzzy wuzzies are always used for connection to nature, like our cotton-tailed rabbit here in the middle. A big poster child for conservation is pollinator conservation is the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly has this amazing migration. There's a lot of conservation happening for the monarch butterfly with milkweed, their host plant milkweed, and also those season-long blooming plants that not only provide habitat for the monarch, but also a variety of other pollinators. So the the poster children, right, of for wildlife conservation. I would also like to nominate the bee fly, because look at this creature. Isn't it the most adorable? These are bee flies. They're a native pollinator. They are a fly. Potentially could be considered a bee mimic. They are the cutest, and these photos are the best because they look kind of gawky and awkward as they're going to look for pollen resources, but they're adorable. So I would like to nominate them as poster children for conservation of pollinators. And I think that burrowing owls, especially being a keystone species, and I'm sure Jason will cover, but I think that burrowing owls are that too. So let's take a look at some images of Burrowing Owls. Keeping it light today. Happy Monday. Go hug a cactus, y'all. This is a good one with the good leg stretch. Feel free to unmute. If there's anybody laughing, I'd love to hear you laugh. We also have
that's an owl sploot.
Oh, if there's a name for this?
Yeah, that's a sploot. That's like what cats do when they stretch out their back legs. That's what I call it. So that's an owl sploot. That's a cute owl sploot.
Is this an Elizabeth term, or is this an official scientific term?
This is an official scientific term coined by the internet. So y'all can Google sploot and you will, well, I'm not going to promise you're not going to see anything weird, but it should show up with cute animals like this. So I swear.
I appreciate that, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. What do we have going on in the chat? We got some good laughs. Okay. So let's see here. We have a good walking. Look at this burrowing owl taking charge. I love this patented look on the burrowing owl, right? But we also have the sweet looks that we get from the burrowing owls as well. Here's another one. And the great head tilt that you can get, the images that are captured, and the feelings and emotions and humor that is elicited from this face here. Here's some goofy guys, some goofy young ones that do a variety. We got the mean look, and then a couple of like, what is going on looks. Oh, that one was, oh, gotta go back this way. Again with the mean. and when I say mean and goofy, obviously I am putting my human experience onto this, right? And anthropomorphizing, if that's a word, I might have just made it up. Here again, here again with that head tilt. Very classic look from the burrowing owl and a lot of images that I've seen, and I do believe this will be our last one. Woke up early, there was no worm. From the National Park Service. They do a great job on their Facebook and social media pages. Any reflections or contributions, cries of outrage? Let's see what's in the chat. Shameless promotion here, but Pioneers Park has an exhibit of wildlife photos. Tom White does. Has an exhibit of wildlife photos, including burrowing owls, and it's up until early August at Pioneers Park. Charlene asked, what was the term when owls put their legs out like that, Elizabeth? So the sploot. Kelly says hello. Kelly. I just need to let everybody know how pivotal she was in helping with the Niobrara Valley Preserve training this past week. You set the bar high for the organization in the support role that the Master Naturalist volunteers. So I really appreciate you, Kelly. And you were missed after you left. We held down the fort, but thank you for passing on the batons as well as you did. You're welcome. Okay, folks. I am going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do it. There we go. And I think we have everybody in. That looks good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop talking and introduce our presenter. Jason is out of the Norfolk Game and Parks office in the Northeast District. He is a wildlife biologist. His main focus is wildlife conservation on private lands in Northeast Nebraska. His favorite bird is the burrowing owl, and his second favorite is the long-billed curlew. That's a good one. Jason lives near Norfolk with his wife and 4 sons. So I am gonna just take it away, Jason. Don't forget to share your sound.
Very good. Thanks for the reminder. Let me see how this goes.
I can see your email.
Working on switching.
Perfect.
Still seeing my email?
Nope, this is perfect.
Okay.
Looks great. Thank you, Jason.
Great. Well, thanks for the invitation, Jamie. I don't know that I would have accepted if I knew that I had to follow the bee fly for my presentation. I've never seen those before, but those are pretty adorable. But I'm still convinced that burrowing owls are the most interesting critter in the world, and I think that everybody should know about the one that's on their logo. As I understand, I think the Nebraska Master Naturalist logo was drawn based on a photo that Michael Forsberg took of a burrowing owl that's kind of stretching as it got out of its burrow. And that is something you see them do from time to time. I don't have any pictures of that, but you'll find I have lots and lots of photos of burrowing owls sitting on fence posts. So you'll get a good taste of that today. So just a little bit about me. Like Jamie said, I grew up in Northeast Nebraska. I lived by the small town of Burrowing, my folks' farm there. I got my bachelor's in fisheries and wildlife at the University of Nebraska. Worked for a little while and then went back to get my master's at South Dakota State University. And I've kind of been all over the east half of the country as a gypsy biologist. I've worked for state, federal, and county agencies. I've worked for NGOs. I've worked a little bit in the private sector doing a variety of different things, from research to management to conservation. But finally got the opportunity to move back close to home. And I've been here in Norfolk for just about 6 years now. I started in August of 2018 doing private lands work. So I share a little about my family. Jamie mentioned I have 4 little boys, and they keep us hopping. Didn't have a great picture. This was us on vacation last year, and the youngest, it's not a great shot of him there, so I had to get one of him. Note that he did start out the day with pants and both socks, but I caught him with this glass of my father-in-law's homemade whiskey, and I guess one thing led to another, and he ended up with no pants and one missing sock. We like spending a lot of time outside. This is us at Ponca State Park. We always go up there every winter and hunt for gnomes. They hide gnomes along the trail, and we like fishing and bird watching and looking for snakes and all kinds of other fun stuff. And then my history with burrowing owls. So I saw my very first one getting close to 20 years ago. Is at the Niobrara Valley Preserve, which some of you were just at this past week. We were at a prairie dog town there. It was a mammalogy class, so we were talking about prairie dogs and bison and some of the other species they have up there. But burrowing owl flew out, and I was pretty excited about that. Little did I know, a few years later, I'd end up going to study them in Western South Dakota for my master's. It's just kind of funny, after you get to where you research something, you just kind of become the person that people turn to for that sort of thing. So one of my first jobs after grad school, my boss said, "Hey, you work with burrowing owls. I have all this data that we've collected over the years. Why don't you try to see if you can get a publication out of it?" So I authored another publication on burrowing owls. And then during the height of the pandemic, when the whole world was shutting down in 2020, I kind of helped coordinate a project to do some burrowing owl surveys in north central Nebraska and the Kepaw River watershed. And we went into South Dakota a little bit too. And then it all kind of came to a head last year. A complete stranger had seen my name somewhere and called and talked to me about burrowing owls for about an hour and offered me his entire collection of photos that he took back in the 70s of some burrowing owls on some land that he used to either own or rent or something. So I've got an envelope full here of some stranger's burrowing owl photos. I'm the burrowing owl guy now, and I'm okay with that. So we're going to talk a little bit about life history. I'm going to call them howdy owls every once in a while. That's kind of an old folksy name that you see in some of the old literature for them. Frankly, I think it's probably a better name. And if they decide to change more species names, I hope they consider the howdy owl. I think they got that name because they've got a kind of habit when they get startled of kind of bouncing their head up and down like they're acknowledging your presence and saying howdy. and they live out on the range where the cowboys do. So it makes a lot of sense. The burrowing owl is a pretty small owl. Many of you may be familiar with screech owls because they live in and around towns and farms a lot. It's only a few inches tall, but they do have really noticeably long legs. That's probably an adaptation for spending a lot of time on the ground. They're pretty well camouflaged with their surroundings, but just alternating brown and white mostly. They have those piercing yellow eyes that we saw in a lot of Jamie's photos, and the white eyebrows. They kind of just give them that really intense look when they stare at you. There's some slight difference in plumage between ages and sexes, and we'll see that in some of the photos here later. But generally speaking, they all look pretty similar to one another. I'm not a big taxonomy guy, but I suppose it's worth noting. So Thiele cunicularia is the species. It's the only member of this genus found in North America. And their closest relative is actually the little owl, which is found in the Old World. And I think actually some of Jamie's owl memes are little owls. It's a very similar looking species. And the genus name comes from the goddess Athena in Greek mythology. She was often depicted with an owl, a little owl next to her. And that's where the genus name comes from. There's somewhere around 15 subspecies that different experts have recognized. There's a little bit of controversy, as there always is, with how those are divided. There's some very distinct populations, but it's pretty clear that the ones we have in Nebraska are the western subspecies. So the range, like I said, they're in North America. So the western burrowing owl, the ones we're talking about here, it's pretty much the west half of the state. This is just a national level range map, which means that it's a little bit generous at times. You can see here how it shows most of the state being part of their range, and historically that would have been true. But this is more representative of their current range in Nebraska, basically the western half to 2/3, with the Panhandle and Southwest being the most common. They're found scattered throughout the sandhills where there's suitable habitat, but they tend to do better in areas with soils that hold their shape a little bit better. And there's a few scattered around the rainwater basin in south central Nebraska as well. Otherwise, the ones over here anymore, they're mostly kind of strays that just end up there. They're passing through on migration. You can note here too that there are some different subspecies found in South America. They're present all year round. There's a Florida subspecies. There's some in the West Indies. So it's a fairly wide-ranging species in the New World. And then this is just a quick overlay with a map from eBird showing sightings in Nebraska over the past 10 years. And you can see that matches pretty closely with that previous. Most of the sightings being in the western part of the state, the Panhandle having a lot, Platte River Valley, and north central Nebraska also has fairly good populations with a scattering through the sandhills. The western burrowing owl is a migratory species. Almost all the ones that we're going to see in Nebraska migrated here to breed here, and then they'll head back south for the winter. It's very rare for them to overwinter in Nebraska. Most of the time in the Great Plains, they start showing up from their wintering grounds sometime around April, late March to April. They've got their pair bonds formed pretty soon after that, which we'll talk about, and then they'll head south about September or October generally. This is an animation from Cornell Lab that's kind of neat. You can kind of ignore the South American population, but if you watch, this is the date here, and you can see right around April when the range starts to fill up in the Great Plains, and then by the end of October, they're pretty much all gone. We don't know a whole lot about the wintering habits and wintering range. I'll talk a little more about that later, but most of them are probably going to southern Texas or Mexico, the ones that we have here. Habitat selection, which is what I spent a lot of my time in graduate school looking at, is where exactly are these things spending the breeding season. In Nebraska and elsewhere throughout the Great Plains, they're mostly found in the short grass and mixed grass prairie region. They were found in the tall grass prairie historically, probably not as common, but as that's gotten more and more converted to row crop agriculture, they're pretty much restricted to the western, the short grass and mixed grass prairie region. Other parts of the range too, like in Arizona, you find them in desert environments. They're found in sagebrush environments in places like Idaho and Wyoming. But the common theme with all of them is that they're open habitats, open landscapes with not a lot of tall trees or tall vegetation. But even more importantly than that, they're very highly dependent on the presence of burrowing mammals. So the burrowing owl name is a little bit of a misnomer because they rarely, if ever, dig their own burrows. The Florida subspecies kind of interesting in that respect because they dig their own burrows, but the Western subspecies almost always, without exception, takes over the burrow that another animal has built, constructed before and left behind. Prairie dogs being the primary one, black-tailed prairie dogs here in Nebraska, but they'll also use things like badger burrows, coyote dens, fox dens, those sorts of things. Gopher tortoises in places where those are present. Anything that creates a hole that's big enough for the owl to get itself into, basically. Of course, things like badgers and coyotes are predators, so they have to be a little careful about where they're picking for their nest sites there, but they're always using abandoned nests, generally speaking. Some important habitat characteristics that you can find in the literature. One of the main ones is very few trees in the surrounding landscape, and that's something I found from my own research in South Dakota. Like a lot of grassland adapted birds, they just don't do well when there's a lot of trees around. Part of that might just be those tend to be places where a lot of their predators are found. Their perch sites for things like hawks, golden eagles, great horned owls, other avian predators, and then they also are den sites for things like raccoons and things that might raid nests. I think that has a lot to do with it. And also they like an open landscape where they can see a long ways, and trees kind of tend to obstruct that. Another thing that's very common with burrowing owl nest sites is that there'll be a lot of satellite burrows around, so other burrows that aren't used for the nest, but that the young can escape to after they hatch. And that's probably a big reason why they like prairie dog towns so much. It gives them a lot of places where they can escape if a predator comes. It also allows, you'll see in some of the upcoming photos that burrowing owls, probably their biggest downside is they're a very messy creature. The nest sites are not nice, clean, tidy places. And so if they can spread the brood out when they get a little bigger, that also kind of reduces the parasite load and probably makes it a little harder for predators to find them too, because they're not all concentrated in a big stinky mass. I didn't find a lot of evidence for that in my study area in South Dakota, but again, that's because they were mostly nesting in prairie dog towns, and I think they always had plenty available to them. Low stature of vegetation. These birds like short grass, and that's pretty much universal. You'll find across all the range and all environments. They like the grass to be really grazed down, and I think that's again a visual thing, so they can see predators. And also it helps them with their hunting strategies. It's easier to see a prey item if it's out on kind of more bare ground. And a lot of their prey likes coming out on that to forage too. And for that reason, you tend to find them more often in what we call active prairie dog towns. So the prairie dog towns where there's actually prairie dogs there. They will nest in towns that have been abandoned or poisoned or, have died from disease or things. But as that grass tends to grow up, the burrowing owls don't usually use it after a couple years because the grass grows up and the burrows start to collapse too without the prairie dogs maintaining them. So that's pretty important. Grazing by livestock or by wild grazers can also help keep that grass down low where the owls like it as well. And another thing that you see in the literature that I don't think is really important in our region, but it is in some places, burrowing owls like to have an elevated perch somewhere near the nest site, a place where they can stand to watch out for danger and to watch out for prey. And in places where there's not a lot of other perches available, they kind of key in on having a little shrub or something nearby. But in this kind of country where we're talking about, there's almost always a fence nearby, or there's a burrowing or a prairie dog mound, just something that gets them elevated. And so I haven't found that in a lot of local research that shows it's as important as it is in some other places. Diet and feeding is pretty interesting. Burrowing owls are carnivores like all owl species are. And the main things that they eat are small mammals and insects. That's really their bread and butter. And anything that is small enough for them to catch. So we've got a meadow vole here. Those are pretty popular. Voles, mice, 13-line ground squirrels, even baby prairie dogs occasionally. But it's those small rodents that are a really key part of their diet. And then insects, grasshoppers, crickets, beetles, anything like that, that's of decent size. Dung beetles are another common prey item that they key in on, and they tend to catch insects pretty much all throughout the day, and that's by far the most numerous prey item they have. But even a little meadow bull like this, when it comes on a mass basis, it takes an awful lot of insects to equal the amount of mass, the grams and the amount of protein that's in, or in calories that's in a rodent versus insects. So biomass wise, small mammals are most important, but numbers wise, insects are usually more important. And just depending on the prey availability in a particular area, you'll find the owls will kind of key in on or even specialize on things that are available to them. So like all owls, they regurgitate pellets of things that they don't digest, and you can identify prey items that way. So this pellet here that I found by a nest burrow, these are almost all from carrion beetles or burying beetles of some sort. So more than likely this owl was going around and there was a dead carcass of some kind of animal there. All these carrion beetles were focusing in on it, and it was just picking them off. It was an opportunistic thing and a good source of food. This pellet here is almost entirely crickets. That's a pretty popular prey item. Here outside this burrow was dragonflies. And I don't know, there must not be a lot of really edible parts on dragonflies because it seems like they left a lot of it behind. But this particular owl is keying in on that as a food source. This is a mummified leopard frog carcass. And I wish I had a better photo. It was like a leopard frog genocide at this nest site here. These owls were really keying in on leopard frogs. And they were just kind of picking out the parts they like best. They'd pick a little meat off the legs and then a couple of the organs outside, and they just leave the rest. But they're all over the place. And the most interesting prey item I found in my research, I blew it way up. So these are claws from a crayfish. And again, at this particular nest site, I don't know if these owls spent the winter in New Orleans and got to like an etouffee or what it was, but there are just crayfish claws scattered all around this nest burrow. And again, they kind of pick out the parts. They eat the hind part that had the most nutrition in it and leave the claws behind. There must not be a lot of claw meat on a crayfish, or the owls just can't get to it. They hunt pretty much day long, especially when they've got young to feed. And as a father of 4 boys, I kind of know how that goes. You've got to scrounge up food and find it when you can, because you're going to get eaten out of house and home. And what they generally do is they'll kind of key in on those insects a lot of times during the daytime, because that's when they're more active. Most of those rodents, they're more nocturnal, and that's they hunt in those nocturnal or crepuscular periods. And they'll hunt a variety of different methods. They'll run on the ground like a chicken or a roadrunner or something. You'll see them a lot of times chasing around beetles, grasshoppers, things on the ground. They'll stand on a perch and just wait there like a red-tailed hawk or something will, watch for movement and swoop down on a rodent or an insect that they see down there. They'll kind of hover. It's not really hovering, but they'll get up in the air, point their head into the wind and flap and kind of stay in one place in the air like a kestrel will. And they'll watch for prey moving on the ground and then dive on it. And they'll also catch insects right out of the air, kind of like a flycatcher would. They'll sally out and catch dragonflies and things like that in the air. During that breeding season, they do cache prey items. So you'll see around nest burrows, they'll just have stacked up rodents there that they've caught overnight. And they'll keep dragging them down and feeding the babies as they need them. And a lot of raptors do that. I mentioned already, they arrive on the breeding grounds in fairly early spring, usually by April or early May. And they pair up pretty soon afterwards. As far as we can tell, the migratory burrowing owls, they don't arrive on the grounds paired already. So they may or may not have the same mate from year to year. They pair up usually when they get on the breeding grounds. We think that the male, generally speaking, selects the nest burrow. And again, they're looking for an abandoned burrow that's a suitable size, that has the depth and the length that they're looking for. And they'll kind of decorate, if you want to call it, the outside of the nest burrow. All this brown material you would see in front of them, this is shredded up dung from cattle or horses or bison, whatever the grazer is around there. And looking at hundreds and hundreds of burrowing owl nests during my master's research, I could probably count on one hand the number of nests I saw that didn't have some kind of dung lining the entrance of the burrow. I have read in the literature there are places where if that's not available to them, they'll use other materials, anything from like foil or pieces of trash they find to horsehair, just any kind of material to kind of line the burrow entrance and just scatter around the opening. And there's not a lot of really good evidence for why they do that. There's some evidence to suggest that it's just a way to indicate to other owls that it's occupied. And I tend to think that's probably the primary reason. But there's also some evidence that it attracts some of the prey items they like dung beetles and crickets, things that like to hide underneath that material. And they've experimentally shown that by scattering that shredded manure around the burrow, that there are more potential prey there. So, it's not mutually exclusive necessarily. It might be both, but it's kind of unique. You'll also a lot of times see around nest burrows, this is whitewash. This is the droppings from the excrement from the owls themselves. And as it gets further and further along in the year, you'll see a lot more of that whitewash along the entrance to the burrow. Like I said, it's a pretty messy place. The males give a call. They call it a cuckoo call, and I'll play it here in a second. It doesn't really sound exactly like a typical owl. You think of it almost sounds more like a mourning dove, I think. But that's how they attract their mates and announce where their territory is. And the males will pretty intensely defend their territory and their nest burrow from other owls and from prairie dogs and from pretty much anything else that comes nearby. And what's kind of interesting about that, this is a very common sight you'll see toward the end of the breeding season. This is on a prairie dog town. You'll notice all the really short grass all around this burrow, but really tall grass next to it. And that's because that owl has been so busy chasing the prairie dogs away from it, they haven't had a chance to graze it down. And so that's a really good indicator sometimes later in the year. If you see a mound out in the middle of a prairie dog town that has a lot more vegetation on it than the rest, there's a decent chance that there's a burrowing owl nest there. So here's the call, the male. Like I said, it sounds kind of like a cross between an owl and a mourning dove. And it is pretty cute. This is one of my favorite sets of photos that I've taken. Their defense posture when they have an intruder. So when I would do surveys for them, I'd play a recording of that call because that helps me detect them. So this is one responding to a call that I was playing from my truck. And gosh, they give you that look, and you kind of fear for your life, especially if you're looking at them through a spotting scope. They look a lot bigger, and it makes you think a little bit before you move any closer. They lay a pretty good sized clutch of eggs, up to a dozen eggs, usually somewhere around 6 to 10. So pretty good number of eggs laid, and they incubate for roughly 4 weeks. And one thing that's interesting about owls compared to some other birds is that the eggs don't hatch all at the same time. Like you think, for example, some of our precocial birds like pheasants and quail and chickens, ducks, they all hatch pretty much at the same time. With owls, they don't. The earlier laid eggs will hatch before the later laid eggs will. And so a lot of times, if you see a whole brood together, they'll be kind of like those little Russian nesting dolls. There'll be ones that are a little bit taller than the next. And sometimes, especially if it's a bad year with a lot of food, those ones that hatch later tend not to survive because the older ones have had a little bit of head start. But if it's a good year, they can very easily raise a brood that large. The chicks remain below ground for a couple of weeks, and they start making little ventures out. And they're not an attractive animal when they're first hatched. They have these really just scattered down feathers all over. It's kind of a face that only a mother could love, but they start looking more and more like the adults as they get a little bit bigger. So this is how big they are when they can just start getting out of the burrow. These ones are getting a little bit closer to fledgling age. They can fly at about 6 to 7 weeks of age. They're still taken care of by the adults to some extent after that. And this is a neat picture. This is a pair, so a male and a female. And as I mentioned, they look virtually indistinguishable. But over the course of the summer, because the female does almost all the incubation and the male is out defending the nest and getting prey and bringing it back to her. So for that 4 weeks when she's incubating, she's almost entirely underground. And over the course of that time, his feathers kind of bleach in the sun, and hers don't. Hers still are nice and unworn. And so if you see two owls next to each other and one that's noticeably lighter in color than the other one, generally speaking, that's going to be a male. And again, it's not a true coloration difference. It's just wear and bleaching. So it's kind of the reverse of when we stay inside. If we stay inside, we get pasty, and if we go outside, we get dark. With burrowing owls, it's the opposite. The males tend to be lighter in color because they spend more time out of doors. And I'd like to talk a little bit about conservation and research needs too. So the burrowing owl, one of the main reasons that I was researching, and a lot of people have, is that it's undergoing declines across its range, and has been for quite a few decades now. It's not a federally listed species. There's quite a number of states, and especially Canadian provinces, where it's listed as threatened or endangered. Here in Nebraska, it's considered a Tier 1 species of greatest conservation need in our State Wildlife Action Plan, or the Legacy Project. And what that means is it's one that we're tracking very closely. We know that it's got some threats that it's facing in the state, and we want to try to keep it as common as possible. Populations wise in Nebraska, its range has gone down quite a bit, but population seems to be relatively stable over the last few decades, just based on the data we do have from breeding bird surveys and other things like that. So some strategies we can use to conserve the species based on the literature that we have so far. First and foremost is just to conserve the grasslands that we have, the open natural landscapes. A big part of that, I think, in our state is just maintaining ranching as our major land use in the western part of the state. Because anytime that it starts changing to other land uses, whether that be row crop agriculture, whether that be suburban development, they can handle some of that to some extent. But as that grazing, that open landscape goes away, the habitat becomes less and less suitable. And then to prevent tree encroachment. And this is a story we've all heard with a lot of grassland birds, from prairie chickens to grasshopper sparrows to meadowlarks. Anytime that you have trees that come in and turn it from more of a grassland to a savanna, and then to even a woodland type, you get a different assemblage of species. And so preventing tree encroachment is going to be a pretty key part of making sure that we still have burrowing owls around decades from now. That's kind of the easier part of the equation. The harder part is probably maintaining viable populations of these other animals that they depend on. Prairie dogs being one of those. And prairie dogs are kind of a heated issue. There's a lot of emotion that goes with it. And in Nebraska and a lot of other states, they're considered a pest. You're required in some cases to keep them under control, especially if your neighbor doesn't want them. And of course, prairie dogs by a lot of wildlife watchers, they're seen as a very, very cute, very charismatic, fun to watch species. And again, there's a lot of emotion that comes to that on both sides. And so to make sure that we've got those around, it's going to take a combination of public and private efforts. Certainly there's places like national parks and grasslands and things where prairie dogs are being conserved and protected to some extent, but most of our land is private land. And if we're going to have prairie dogs and then therefore burrowing owls, it's going to take some efforts on private land too to make sure that happens. And I don't have all the answers to that. I've certainly got some ideas, but whatever we do have to address the concerns that the landowners have to their livelihood from prairie dogs, because they do eat a fair amount of forage. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that might not be as detrimental to things like cattle as might be thought, but they do take away forage that's available. They also can facilitate the invasion of some invasive species like thistles and things. Of course, that's not the prairie dog's fault, but they open up a lot of bare ground that lets seeds of those species come in, and that's something again that landowners are required to control, and it's an extra expense to them. So keeping that balance between what landowners, ranchers are able to handle and what's needed to keep the species there is something that is always going to have to be addressed. And when we're managing prairie dog populations, and there's a lot of different ways that's done, is just to make sure we're considering the non-target effects on other species. So poisoning is certainly the most common way that people control prairie dogs, manage prairie dogs to keep them from expanding. But there are some poisons that have a much higher risk of non-target, secondary poisoning or primary poisoning than others. So watching, then there's regulations that have kind of helped that to some extent, but to make sure that poisoning is done according to label directions, and trying to avoid non-target effects. We're doing it at times of the year where there's not migratory birds there as much. Would be another thing to consider. Tunnel destruction is something that sometimes people will just plow through an area to break up the tunnels, either before or after they poison the prairie dogs. So again, trying to time that for times where they're not harming other organisms that are using the burrows. And then shooting is another strategy that's used a lot of times. And that's something that can be done with fairly minimal effect, but if people aren't educated or just plain, I'm not going to use the word that's really in my mind, but I have seen situations where burrowing owls and other species have been shot by people that were out on prairie dog towns shooting prairie dogs, and it was clearly intentional. I think that's a fairly small. We probably need to get more information on that. I think that's a small, a fairly limited thing, but it's out there. And it can happen accidentally too. So through education and making sure people are aware that they're out there is another thing to make sure that we're not having unintended consequences. Prairie dog hunting is a way that can, in a way, keep prairie dog towns out there, because it won't ever eliminate them, but at least they'll still be there providing that habitat for other species. So if it can be done in a way that addresses these concerns to other species, it might be a viable option to maybe to appease landowners that want the populations controlled to some extent, but to provide that prairie dog town habitat we're looking for. And this is a good example. This is a picture that was taken in north central Nebraska. This is a prairie dog town in, I think, Boyd County, Nebraska, north central part of the state. And you can see here, like, this is a prairie dog town where it's clearly there's some shorter grass here where the prairie dogs have been keeping it clipped down, but probably not losing a lot of forage here. This shouldn't be something that is a big economic impact to the rancher. But if you look around it, you can see the cedar trees and some of the brush coming in, which is going to get more and more. This is something that we can all agree on. We could help this lander out with using some prescribed fire cutting to eliminate some of these trees from the surrounding landscape. That'll keep this prairie dog town as a suitable nesting location for burrowing owls. It'll keep this rancher's grazing land from getting encroached where they can't run cattle on it. And it's really just kind of one of those win-win things. A lot of times, prairie dog towns are kind of concentrated around water sources like this too. So another thing to consider is maybe, putting water sources in some different places to minimize that grazing pressure and keep those prairie dog towns from expanding so much. That's something that might be appealing to a landowner. But like with a lot of species that we have a lot of gaps. There's still a lot of things we don't know, and we need to know better so that we can manage these species better. And I mentioned previously, we need to learn a lot more about their wintering grounds, these migratory populations. In the last few years, we've gotten access to some smaller GPS tracking devices. It's a little one that weighs about 5 or 6 grams. So something like a burrowing owl that's a very small species can carry that on its back during its migration. They can track that remotely. This was actually taken in Nebraska. This researcher is putting some of these on burrowing owls and tracking their migration. And so we've learned a little bit more that a lot of these owls are going down to southern Texas, Mexico, places like that. But there's not a lot of research done down there to see what kind of habitat they're using down there and what threats they might face down there. And that's the case with a lot of migratory birds that spend half their life in one, in the southern hemisphere and half their life in the northern. There's a real disconnect. We don't know. We don't always know what's going on in both places, and population declines might be more tied to the wintering grounds than they are to the summering grounds in some cases. So that's something that needs a lot more research. We also need to do more studies on how prairie dog management impacts survival and productivity of burrowing owls. So personally, from my research, I found that the prairie dog colony size doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of difference. Burrowing owls will use very large colonies, they'll use very small colonies. But there is some research in other places that have shown there may be some advantages to them being able to nest in bigger colonies because they might have a little bit less threat of predation that way. So they might survive, produce more chicks that way. But at the same time, some of these smaller colonies might be places that are less vulnerable to being poisoned out or to being poisoned or to being affected by sylvatic plague, which has hit a lot of states in the last few years. That's the same plague that killed half of Europe back in the Middle Ages. It's come over here now, and it'll wipe out entire prairie dog colonies in just a matter of a few weeks. and sometimes they don't end up getting repopulated. So it might be that some of these small isolated colonies might make the prairie dogs and therefore the burrowing owls a little less vulnerable to getting wiped out by that too. So there's a lot of research that needs to go into the play between how the prairie dogs are doing and how the owls are doing as a result of that. And we also need to look at the importance of the burrowing owl populations that are outside the range of prairie dogs. Like I mentioned, prairie dogs are very, very important. That's where most of our owls are found, but they will nest in places without them if their habitat is suitable otherwise. And so I think something we could consider, especially where we know that eastern Nebraska was historically a part of the range, maybe there's some things we can do creating artificial nest burrows. They've had some success with that in other places. And maybe using grazing some places a little harder to get with cattle to get that low vegetation they like. And maybe we can somehow attract burrowing owls to nest in some of these places where there aren't prairie dogs, and that'll allow their range to expand a little bit, make them a little more resilient to other changes that are happening in the environment and such. That's something we should probably look into and see if burrowing owls can be successful in those environments. And that might be ways that we can conserve them in places where it's just not realistic to have prairie dogs. And I want to wrap up here with just some tips. I said, hopefully by now you're convinced that burrowing owls are just something you got to absolutely go see. And so I'm just going to give a few pointers for how you can find these guys. The first thing to do, and this might seem but look for a place that has a history of burrowing owls being there. And eBird, eBird.org is just a really fantastic resource for that. You can search and you can look. It'll show you exactly where prairie dogs have been reported in the last year, the last 10 years, back as far as we have records as far as that goes. But then I just zoomed in on a part of western Nebraska here. And so the orange dots, that indicates that burrowing owls were seen in that location in the last month. So if you're going to go make a trip, I'd start with eBird, look for those orange dots, places that you can get to access where there's been some before. And I put some historically reliable locations. So out in the Panhandle, the Oglala National Grasslands, Alliance, Scottsbluff area have prairie dog towns around and are very reliable for burrowing owls. Crescent Lake always has some every year. But also in the rainwater basin, there's some waterfowl production areas. These are federal areas that are used primarily to provide habitat for nesting waterfowl. But some of these do have prairie dog towns on there. There's one called Prairie Dog Waterfowl Production Area. And then this Holteen, or I'm not actually sure how you pronounce it, but this one is probably the furthest east place in Nebraska that you can reliably find burrowing owls. It's not too far from like York or Aurora. So even people that are in the very far east part of the state, it's not a real far drive to drive there and have a pretty good chance of seeing them. And then if you want to poke into South Dakota, La Creek National Wildlife Refuge is just across the border. It's some of the sand hills that South Dakota borrows from us. There's some found there. Badlands National Park, Wind Cave National Park are also very, very good places to see them as well. So find your location and then find the prairie dogs, because again, that's where they're most commonly going to be found. I like to pull up something like Google Earth aerial imagery and find where those prairie dog towns are located. And they usually jump out pretty well in aerial image. You can see the mounds here. You can see the different colored vegetation where the prairie dogs are clipping it down lower, because there's going to be different forbs and different grasses growing there than there is in the surrounding area. And if you can find one obviously that's close to roads that you can get good access to, I mean, this would be a absolutely perfect place to go look for burrowing owls. Prairie dog towns, I mentioned this on a previous slide, a lot of times they're close to water sources for cattle, whether that's a cattle tank or a farm pond or something, because cattle spend a lot of time around water, therefore they graze a lot around water. And when they graze a lot, that is a place where prairie dog towns like to get established and where they can expand as well. So a lot of times you'll find them near water sources. Right now is probably the best time of year to go look for burrowing owls, July and August, because that's when the most owls are going to be above ground. The young are all mobile now, so they're up running around out of their burrows, flying around. That early spring period, only the adult males are going to be above ground. Mom's down underground at the eggs of the babies. So early spring is a decent time, but late summer is the best time to go early or late in the day because the owls are more active then. And then also, as a lot of you probably know, when you get these hot days, you get kind of that shimmer, that haze that comes up from the ground when it's really hot, and you can't see through your spotting scope nearly as far. So early or late in the day is the best, and bring a spotting scope if you have one. These things blend in really well. So a spotting scope lets you see the ones that are just peeking their heads up out of the burrow that you might not see with even just binoculars sometimes. It's a good tool if you have one. I like to start looking at the edge of the colony because that's usually where the nests are located. They can be out in the middle, but they usually like to be around the edges. And I think that's because they like that kind of, a lot of times there's a lot of abandoned burrows along the edge because that's kind of where the colony is always shrinking or expanding. And also it gets them close to some different kinds of habitats where they can forage. And don't forget to look up because, like I said, you'll see some cool behaviors like those owls that are hovering, or you might see a male that's bringing a mouse back to the nest to share with the babies. So don't get so concentrated on looking at the ground that you miss some of the other action that's going on. And call playback, you can increase your odds if you play that call. Like I said, I kind of hesitate to say this because I kind of have some mixed feelings on using call playback, but it can be effective. I would just be very cautious about using it in areas that get birded a lot, places like national parks that a lot of people are coming to, because as you see, those male owls especially, they get pretty charged up when they hear that. And if they're out defending their nest against a phantom intruder, that's more time that they're not spending providing for their babies, and their stress level is higher. So, for research purposes, like where it's a one-time visit, it's probably fairly minimal impact. It's not no impact, but for something that's just for routine birding, I generally don't recommend it, but it is something that you can up your odds. I just want to share here, obviously there's a very large literature on burrowing owls. I just kind of highlighted a few key ones here. Martha Desmond, Courtney Conway, David Johnson. Those are some of the kind of big names in burrowing owl research that have done a lot. I've got a couple of my own publications in here, but if you're just looking for general information, you can't beat Birds in Nebraska Online, which is a publication available online that Nebraska Game and Parks, some partners, puts out, or the All About Birds. This is Cornell Lab of Ornithology, kind of their free general information on pretty much any species. Those are good places to start. And then if you really want to dig into the literature, here's some here. I have no idea where we're at on time, but I'm done with that. If we've got time for some questions, I'd sure take some.
Yeah, I'd like to start off the questions by saying I misspoke and called burrowing owls a keystone species. I got my wires crossed. It's the prairie dogs. That's the keystone species.
Yep.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Rita asks, how likely are we to find burrowing owls in active prairie dog towns? Do we know a percentage, give or take, even in counties outside of the shaded areas from the sightings map?
Okay. You said the question was what percentage of active towns have owls? Is that
yes.
it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Pretty high. I don't have any hard numbers for Nebraska specifically, but pretty much anywhere that research has been done, it's quite high. Anywhere from 50 to 80%, generally speaking. And like I said, active towns generally have higher likelihood of having burrowing owls. They will use abandoned towns, but the active towns are usually best.
Let's see. Do burrowing owls continue to call or go silent during nesting season like great horns?
Yeah, the calling definitely slows down later, and especially after the young have hatched. They call more often in that early nesting period when they're, again, just setting up, defending their territory, protecting the mother while she's incubating. And I even noticed when I was doing my research, like when I did the call playback thing, it was much, much less effective come July and August than it was in May and June. But it didn't really matter at that point because, like I said, everything was up above ground at that point, so they were a lot easier to detect visually. Mm-hmm. But it does taper off significantly into the summer.
Will burrowing owls eat a snake? And
Absolutely.
and are they carrion eaters at all? Like would they eat like a dead prairie dog if somebody shot the prairie dog and then would they
Yep.
eat it?
Yep, they will do that from time to time, and that's one thing I didn't mention. That's another kind of concern with the shooting bit is that like a lot of things that could potentially be scavengers, they're somewhat vulnerable to lead poisoning. There isn't a lot of evidence that that's as big a threat to them as it is things like eagles and vultures and stuff. And it's probably just like a volume thing, kind of the poisons of the dose sort of thing. I don't know, and they're not scavengers to the extent that those larger species are. But that is something that is a concern if it does happen.
If there are any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself or pop them in the chat.
I see there's a comment here about the Florida burrowing owls, and yeah, that is they do quite a bit down there to protect them. And the Florida population, like I said, that they're just a completely different beast in their behavior and their nesting strategy and stuff. But I mean, there's probably a lot of things we could learn from that effort too. And there's been some literature in the last 2 years that people have been doing some work on the western subspecies where there's development going on, like if a known nesting site is going to be developed for housing or commercial or what have you, where they've been translocating some burrowing owls into new locations, either artificial nest burrows or to other prairie dog towns, and they're learning some things. Like a lot of translocation efforts, they tend not to do as well reproductive performance wise, especially that first year. But they did find that in some of the research that's been done, if they can make it survive that first year of translocation, they will return to their new location the second year and do just as well as the other ones. So there's some potential promise there.
Heidi, I'm sure Jason, are there other different kinds of calls besides the one that you use, right? The birds have a variety of different calls.
They do, yeah. And the one that I didn't really look real hard, but the most interesting one is the one that the young make. So the nestlings, when they're in their burrow, they actually will make a call when they're alarmed. It sounds, you have to use your imagination a little bit, but it sounds a little bit like a rattlesnake. And it's probably, again, just a sort of mimicry thing that might deter some would-be predators from entering the burrow. And then the adults make an alarm call that it's not a nice sound, but it gets your attention. But yeah, they have a variety of calls.
Heidi, you can go over to the Cornell lab and then search burrowing owls, and they'll have a whole list of their different calls and the different kinds of calls so that you can hear them. That's correct, Jason, right?
Yep.
Not getting my wires crossed with that.
Yep.
Let's see. How many do we have an idea of what the population is in Nebraska?
I'm not going to say a number that I'm not confident of, but if you go to that Birds in Nebraska online, I know that there's an rough estimate on there that they determined using some of the breeding bird survey efforts. But yeah, I don't know it off the top of my head. I'm not going to make something up.
Yeah. Do breeding pairs stay together for more than one season? That's a good question.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of great information on that because there just hasn't been a lot of banding efforts on them and a lot of people looking at it. I strongly suspect that occasionally the same birds will pair up from time to time because we do know that they will return to the same prairie dog town and sometimes the same burrow from year to year. But they definitely will switch pairs from year to year too. Like I said, it seems like they pair up once they arrive on the nesting ground. So they don't seem to migrate together or probably spend time together on the wintering grounds. They kind of take a break, I guess, or something. But
very good. So we're coming up at the end of our hour. If you have to take off, I understand. I am going to go ahead and go through our upcoming events and our call to action. If I see that there were a few questions in, I will send these last few questions in the chat to Jason Or if I don't know the answers, I will get the questions to Jason to get them answered to you. Any final words, Jason?
No, thanks for listening in. I'm always happy to talk about these things, whoever will listen. And if anybody wants an excuse to go look for sometime, don't feel free to reach out. I never turned down a chance to drive left on the map and go look for some owls.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Jason, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Can I get you to stop sharing your screen? Thank you. Yep. All right, real quick, we'll go through the upcoming events and I'll get y'all on your way. All right, Barbara, are we good? Can you see it? Awesome. Okay. Let's see. So evaluations, and I will send a follow-up email from this presentation, and there will be an evaluation. Please fill out the evaluation. This is how I'm an advocate for the membership. So what you want is what I'm gonna make happen for you. I'm gonna work to make happen for you. So please let me hear your voice. Say what you have. Give me your feedback. It's really, really important. So I'll send that link to you in the follow-up email. Next month's webinar is with Katie Lamke, from Xerces Society. She runs the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas, and she's going to talk to us about wild bees of Nebraska. That's really exciting. I will get that out on the listserv probably this week sometime, so you can start registering. And Rita, and get you all registered for that, and I'll put it up out on social media as well. I also want to let you know registration will be out for our Nebraska Master Naturalist Fall Conference. That date will be September 28th, and we will be hosting it at Chadron State College. September 28th at Chadron State College. Registration, I'm hoping, will be out this week. And also I will, along with the registration, I will be sending out a call for presentations or annual update submissions. So I'm asking from the Master Naturalist community or Master Naturalist partnerships or program supporters, if you have any presentations. I do believe I'm putting a cap of 15 minutes on presentations. And if you don't feel comfortable presenting in front of your peers, that makes a lot of sense. I have problems doing that too. I have anxiety wrapped around that. Then I'm also taking your annual update submissions. So if you have inspirations or motivations or some things that happened that were inspiring during the season through your work with Nebraska Master Naturalists, I will collect all of those submissions and I will add them to the annual update that will be presented by. And that portion will be presented either by myself, or by one of our fellow Master Naturalists. So this is an effort to hear from Master Naturalists what y'all have been doing over this past season, because that's exciting. Also, let's see. We have the October Core 24 training coming up, the 11th and 12th and the 8th and 19th. If you know of anybody that's interested in becoming a Master Naturalist, please let them know about this training. I still have spots available. And in the email, in the post follow-up email, I will also put in a flyer that is easily printed off on your home computer, so you could pass that out to different places or post it in different places. Our annual reunion is also coming up. I will be sending out one last spiel around the interwebs for you to register to keep your spot, reserve your spot for the training or for the annual reunion. We're all really excited. I was just out at Niobrara Valley Preserve, and that's where it's going to be. And it is a beautiful, lovely space. The facilities are absolutely wonderful, and I'm excited to get back. So that will be coming around the bend in social media and the listserv as well. Here's that flyer that can easily be printed on your home computer if you wanted to promote the training in October. Again, just a plug for the new tracking system. If you're on here, we have the new tracking system. I am available to help anybody that needs help, because and anytime there's any new software or any kind of new technology, a lot of the times there's a learning curve, and I'm learning and you're all learning. So please feel free to reach out. I know that over the week I was at the training, I got some emails, so I will be reaching out to those folks this week. And our call to action, right? So with a journal or a piece of paper or your diary or on your phone, if you like to take notes with your phones, observe different species, something that's either in your backyard or something that you see when you're out on a hike, plant, mammal, bird, insect, amphibian, reptile. And then make a list of the interconnectedness or the systems, the life or death that can be linked to this one species. I know that we all, as master naturalists, remember, we all are aware of the interconnectedness and the web of life. We all remember, we all know this piece about how everything is connected. But it's always nice to go back and refresh ourselves and just really remember how interconnected things are, and just to take a tally of how all the different things. One of my favorite things to think about is how more alive a dead tree is than it was when it was alive. So thinking of all of the creatures that are making that are now living because of that dead tree. So that's something that I like to spin around in the old brain pan. And I think that's it. So I appreciate you all hanging in here with me. I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm gonna get out of here on this. I'll be sending out an email, if not today, tomorrow. And this has been recorded, and it will be up on our Nebraska Master Naturalist YouTube page. I'm grateful for all of you. I'm grateful to be here, and I'm looking forward to next time. Bye, Will. Bye, Judy.
Bye, Jamie.
Bye, Barbara.